Here we are, Loco Profiling episode 10, my final YouTube video. Hence why I have it all really dark here and kind of moody, so yeah. So, first of all, no Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays or any of that stuff, because if I was to do that, chances are likely that would also include, the people who were ultimately responsible for me making the decision to leave YouTube in the first place. And no, I'm not coming back. I'll keep the channel on. I may post some comments here and there, but I'm not going to upload any more videos. So yeah. Basically, I just wanted to end the career by, taking a really big stab at an American locomotive, and particularly the fan base of said American locomotive, because at the end of the day, it doesn't deserve the fan base that it ended up building. So there you have that. So before we actually get to the locomotive, which some of you have actually guessed correctly, let me actually throw a little issue here. You know how there are certain railroads in the United States that had a pretty long official name that also ended up being a little bit boring? Well, the people who worked on the railroad, whether it would be locomotive crews, back shop employees, motive power department, the management department and the CEOs or whatever, public relations department, you get the idea. The people who worked on those various railroads were also smart enough to come up with a shorter, catchier nickname to also further grab interest for the railroad. And unfortunately, there are those sad people out there who prefer to use the longer, official, and boring name of those railroads. Jesus fucking Christ, guys. I mean, who do you think you are? Andrew Lieb, the Wikipedia man? Come on. So, before we actually get into the locomotive proper, before we talk about the locomotive that is the subject of this video, here's a list of a bunch of American railroads where I actually have the long official names written down on some paper here. And obviously we're going to give the shorter, catchier nicknames so you don't look like an idiot. Starting with the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. The Rock Island. In fact, if the logo had most of that red replaced with the other 5 colors in the rainbow and the capital R replaced with a C, it would be the Cock Island Railroad. Perfect for gay jokes. Sorry I didn't come up with that one in June, but there you go. Next we have the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. The Milwaukee Road. Simple, honest, direct language, guys. Seriously. Then we have also included from the city of Chicago, or from the city of Chicago, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which most people actually refer to by an abbreviation of that name, CB and Q. That's fine, I suppose. But if you look on the tenders, or possibly on the water tanks of any tank engines they might have had, you'll notice that there is a logo with a shorter, catchier nickname, Burlington Route, which is always going to get my preference. I mean, CB and Q is fine, but Burlington Route sounds so much cooler. In either case, never use the official name unless you're trying to get people introduced to that railroad or whatever. Then there's the Carolina, Clinchfield, and Ohio Railway. Most people just call it the Clinchfield Railroad because, it literally says Clinchfield on the sides of the tender or water tanks, whatever. Then two railroads that stretch out, that each kind of stretch out from a city where the name starts with a D, and they go out to the west. Those being the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, and the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. Okay, sorry if Delaware isn't a city, but more so like a county or a state. Apologies, but whatever. In either case, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western can simply just be referred to as the Lackawanna Railroad, and the Denver and Rio Grande Western can be simply referred to as the as the Rio Grande Railroad. What's so difficult about that? Also, by the way, AJ, in case you're watching this, I'm really sorry for trying to make you say the abbreviated version of the Rio Grande's full name. You know, DNRGW. I'm sorry, I should have just typed Rio Grande. Then there's the super overrated one, the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, where, admittedly, a lot of people do simply refer to that railroad by its full name. I mean, not the full name, but the catchy nickname, the Nickel Plate Road. So, yeah, there you have that. How about a pretty obscure one that not a whole lot of people talk about? The Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad. This is actually a subsidiary of the New York Central, by the way. But yeah, it actually comprises... Yeah, its name is actually comprised of the names of 4 pretty big cities. Cleveland, Ohio, Cincinnati, New York, Chicago, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. But there is a shorter, catchier nickname for that railroad as well. No, we're not going to use the abbreviation CCC and ST or L or whatever. No, we're simply going to call it the Big Four Railroad. No confusion for UK audiences with the Big Four railway companies in the United Kingdom between 1923 and 48. Whoa. How about the St. Louis and Southwestern Railroad? The Cotton Belt Route. Or there's the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, usually just referred to in short as the Santa Fe. But yeah, I mean, I didn't have that one written down, but it's also an easy example. And finally, the railroad that our locomotive that serves as the subject for this episode hails from, the St. Louis and San Francisco Railway, which most people simply refer to as the Frisco, because it even says so on the cab side sheets of those engines. With that out of the way, let's finally uncover the dark truth behind the subject matter of Loco Profiling, Episode 10. Frisco number 1522. Yes, I have a huge disliking, bordering on hatred for this locomotive. But first, info regarding the class. As you can see, 1522 is a 482 mountain-type locomotive, built in 1926 as part of the Frisco's T54 class of mountain types. Built across 3 batches at the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the class totaled 30 locomotives that were built there from 1923 to 1926, numbered 1500 through 1529. Admittedly, there didn't seem to be much wrong with these locomotives, as they were really well liked by pretty much everybody who worked on the Frisco. Locomotive crews, dispatchers, motive power department, maybe even the management department, you name it. They were definitely a true general-purpose machine, fast enough for passenger service, powerful enough for freight service. A boiler pressure of 200 psi, a pair of 28 by 28 inch cylinders, and 69 inch diameter driving wheels helped to let the locomotives generate 54,085 pounds of tractive effort. Maybe that's why they were called the T-54s, but whatever. I don't know when locomotive 1522 was retired, but I do know that it was donated in 1950, finding a new home at the Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, and it seemed the locomotive was to endure a peaceful retirement as a static display piece. But in 1985, this would come to an end, when a new force of evil entered the story of this engine. The St. Louis Steam Train Association, or SLSTA for short. Any brony out there who wants to pronounce that abbreviation as Celestia is to be beaten up on sight. Anyway, this was a preservation society that was interested in borrowing or leasing the 1522 and have the engine rebuilt and restored to operational condition for use on excursion trains on various railroads in and around St. Louis. So, why am I calling them evil? Simple. There was a fundamental problem with them. if you wanted to join them as a volunteer to help keep 1522 in operational condition and learn the necessary skills to repair and operate a steam locomotive, too fucking bad! This is a very harsh way of saying that you couldn't join them, because the organization was run by a bunch of selfish jackasses who didn't like the idea of letting newbies join their little club, treating the 1522 as their locomotive. Oh, sure, you could buy their merchandise or directly donate a bunch of money to them, but actually joining as a volunteer and making a physical contribution, helping out in the necessary repairs and whatever? Fat chance, because nobody was allowed to do that! So basically, you can say that when 1522's rebuild and restoration was completed in 1988, its days of running in the preservation era were already numbered. No extensions possible. Her excursion career could only be shortened. And that is a genuine fucking shame, because the engine actually ended up doing some pretty cool stuff in preservation. Most prominently in 1990 in St. Louis, when the engine was essentially the local star at that year's edition of the National Railway Historical Society convention. But even then, I dare to say that the engine was vastly overshadowed by the three guest engines: Cotton Belt 819, Union Pacific 844, and Norfolk and Western 1218. I'm not sorry when I say that a mountain type doesn't stand a chance against two Northerns and an articulated that's basically a Challenger missing one of its pilot axles. Hell, imagine if Union Pacific actually converted Challenger 3985 to an oil burner a little bit sooner, so they could take that engine to St. Louis as well. Two Northerns and two articulateds. That would have been epic. Then the year 1995 happened. Painfully remembered following the incident that changed steam locomotive preservation in the United States forever. On June 16th of that year, another steam locomotive, Canadian Pacific 1278, had tragically suffered a boiler explosion while hauling a dinner train on the Gettysburg Railroad, between Gettysburg and Mount Holly Springs, Pennsylvania. The cause of the accident was a low water level in the boiler that didn't match what was displayed on the water glasses in the cab, thanks to the truly piss-poor pathetic maintenance standards on the Gettysburg. So their steam engines were less like proper, well-maintained machines and more like operational scrapyard wrecks. Fortunately though, 1278 had a cleverly designed boiler and firebox, resulting in the engine only suffering an internal boiler explosion. So fortunately, the locomotive wasn't destroyed, and far more importantly, nobody was killed. But that's not to say that the incident was minor. Far from it. Though nobody died, there were still 3 casualties in the form of the locomotive's crew, the engineer and 2 firemen, who all suffered bad burns thanks to scalding hot steam spewing out of the firebox doors and quickly filling the cab. And the locomotive itself was obviously crippled and taken out of service. But of course the biggest legacy of this incident was that the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, enforced a much stricter set of rules and regulations, including the 1472-day inspections, to make steam locomotive operation much safer. Those inspections were named as such because while they can take place once every 15 years, ideally, you want them to take place once every 1,472 service days across those 15 years, which would be just over 4 years if you were to keep an engine running for 1,472 days in a row. The reason for this rather lengthy intermission about the 1278 boiler explosion on the Gettysburg is that while other tourist railroads and preservation societies were able to do a good job at adjusting to the new rules and regulations, ironically, the SLSTA seemed to be a pretty big exception to the rule. Because from 1995 onwards, 1522 actually suffered a bunch of flue failures. To say nothing about the locomotive suffering a minor derailment on a Y in St. Louis in 1999. Then there was also a rumor that painted an extra negative picture of the SLSTA. While the rumor turned out to be false, and thus it didn't happen, I'll tell it anyway because I haven't complained enough. The story goes that the SLSTA, and maybe a few executives of the Museum of Transportation, or MOT, were invited in June of 2002 to bring the 1522 over to the Grand Canyon Railway near the town of Williams, Arizona, so they could participate in that year's NRHS convention, to be held in August. That way, the 1522 could explore some new ground and operate alongside the GCR's own steam fleet, comprised of Lake Superior and Ishpeming 18 and Burlington Route 4960, a 280 Consolidation and a 282 Mikado respectively, and the other guest engine, another big Northern Santa Fe 3751. However, according to the rumor, the SLSTA had misinterpreted the invitation as a trick, like they were being lured into an elaborate scheme set up by the GCR to try and get the MOT to sell 1522 to the GCR so it wouldn't go back to St. Louis and stay in Williams, rendering the SLSTA useless. Subsequently, the SLSTA volunteers were gripped with fear, being positively paranoid about the prospect of losing their locomotive, which they didn't own but just leased from the MOT, getting into fierce arguments which further soured the relationship between the two organizations. Again, this was just a false rumor, a myth that was busted, as apparently there was no invitation sent out to the SLSTA or the MOT. But honestly, if it was true, I wouldn't be surprised given the SLSTA's previously mentioned reputation of being a bunch of selfish jackasses who denied new members from joining their organization. And that reputation would cost them dearly, as throughout the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the lack of new volunteers, the current volunteers getting old, and the frequent flu failures would make things more and more difficult. And at the end of September 2002, the inevitable happened. 1522 made a couple of final trips before it was taken out of service once more and placed back into retirement, under the convenient guise that it became too expensive to run the locomotive, thanks to rising insurance costs. While it is true that the insurance became more expensive, we can actually thank the SLSTA itself for the downfall of 1522's second career, because now they had nobody who could take over for them. If they did allow new members to join their organization, there might have been a possibility that a few of them were able to come up with clever ways of quickly raising more money to keep the engine operational and pay for the insurance. But no. Instead, the oil burners were shut off for the final time. The boiler, hopefully, drained of any water that was left, and the locomotive got a cleaning job to make it nice and presentable for its fate as a permanent display piece at the MOT. Yeah, MOT is short for Museum of Transportation, in case you couldn't figure that one out. And following the debacle with the SLSTA, I definitely see the MOT issuing a new policy that nobody is allowed to lease any of their locomotives ever again, if the intention is to rebuild them to operational condition. Honestly, I dare to say that the world would have been a slightly better place if 1522 was immediately broken up for scrap upon its retirement, thus preventing the future with the SLSTA, and the empty space it would have left behind at the MOT could have been filled up with a different mountain-type locomotive that did deserve to be saved. Illinois Central 2613, which was used on some farewell to steam trips for the Illinois Central themselves between 1959 and 60, and even the LNN Centennial Special, the final steam-powered passenger train on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, between its namesake cities of Louisville, Kentucky and Nashville, Tennessee, in 1959. In fact, because of this, the Illinois Central tried to save 2613 by selling it, or maybe donating it if they were gracious enough, to the Kentucky Railway Museum when it was still located in Louisville. But the plan failed due to the KRM volunteers and staff saying that they didn't have enough space, because the space for a large steam engine had already been occupied by a 284 Berkshire locomotive. Or Kanawha, I should say. Yeah, Chesapeake and Ohio 2716. So tragically, 2613 ended up being broken up for scrap. And to all of you out there who are crying about me saying that the world would have been a better place if 1522 was scrapped, there are 5 other T-54 mountains left in preservation, on display at various parks and museums. Those being 1501, no confusion with that Great Western or British Railways pannier tank, 1519, 1526, 1527, and 1529. Hell, there's actually been an announcement somewhat recently that that third engine is actually going to get a cosmetic restoration. So what are you waiting for? Don't just sit there wishing that 1522 will return to steam. It shouldn't happen. Start caring about those 5 other T-54 mountains already! Little bit of additional information on 1522. During the final stages of editing of this video, I actually learned from Ryan, one of my best friends at the moment, that 1522 had also made a few cameos in the 1995 movie Truman, which is about former U.S. President Harry Truman during the 1948 elections, as well as a few other noteworthy moments in his presidency, probably. I haven't seen the whole movie, I will freely admit. I should probably do that. He mainly linked me the movie just to point out that 1522 tragically made a couple of cameos pulling Truman's campaign train, or presidential train, because he was president at the time, of course, having taken over from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But yeah, real pity they couldn't get the actual locomotive at the time, Grand Trunk Western 6325. Yep, that locomotive, a relatively small northern, had actually pulled Truman's presidential train during the 1948 elections. It's a real pity that locomotive hadn't been rebuilt at the time they made that movie, because that could have been really cool, actually, to make it a bit more historically accurate, because I would rather see that engine as opposed to 1522 in action. But yeah, speaking of 1522, somebody had to tell this really tragic and dark story. Right? Right. And in case you're wondering where the hell I even got this information from about the SLSTA not accepting new members, I got it from a friend of mine who once rode the Joliet rocket trips. And he actually had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Wayne York, who is the final survivor, or the last survivor, of the 4 original members of the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society. So he's been around the block a few times when it comes to steam locomotive preservation societies, when they were trying to rebuild or restore their locomotives. And when my friend was actually talking to Mr. York, Mr. York, that is. He mentioned how it was very unfortunate how the St. Louis Steam Train Association never allowed new volunteers into their organization. So yeah, they ultimately just shot themselves in the foot. It's their own fault they decided to retire the locomotive. They didn't have anybody else. They didn't have anybody else who could take over for them. Rising insurance costs were just a convenient little guise, even if the insurance was getting more expensive at the time. But yeah, again, because of that, because of what the SLSTA did, I can actually perfectly understand it if the Museum of Transportation has decided that nobody is ever allowed to borrow or lease or even buy any of their engines ever again if the intention is to rebuild and restore them to operational condition. Basically, the one time that they sent Norfolk and Western 2156 over to Roanoke, Virginia, that could probably be the only time, if not the last time. So, yeah. Also, speaking of Norfolk and Western locomotives, yes, I also know about the accident with 475, how it managed to smash a smoke buck first into an excavator. Not a backhoe, an excavator. A backhoe is basically just a tractor that's trying to be a front-end loader, because it has a bucket-style shovel on the front, and then it also has an excavator arm on the back. The vehicle that 475 crashed into, yeah, excavator. Small cab on a small rotating cab with a digger arm attached to it, mounted on a platform with treads. Excavator. Learn your terminology with construction vehicles and earth-moving equipment and whatever. It's, yeah, quick little opinion on that. It's kind of stupid. There are multiple people at the Strasburg Railroad to blame for that. I would say it's partially the fault of the locomotive crew because they didn't take the action to throw the switch and have it set to the correct track when they realized that it wasn't set to the right track. But it was also the fault of the people who were last there, like, what was it, the maintenance of way gangs or whatever? Because they locked the switch in the wrong position. So, two different sides of the same organization are to blame. The only thing that I really have to say about it, it's a real tragedy the locomotive still managed to return with the centered headlight. It's impressive that they actually managed to get the locomotive repaired quite quickly, and that at least the inside of the locomotive didn't get any major damage. But I hate seeing 475 with a centered headlight. I mean, this could have been a glorious opportunity to build a new shelf to give it the classic high headlight look, and have the smoke box door be once again embellished with a simple circular number plate, because that's my preferred look. I hate 475 with a centered headlight. It looks wrong to me. But yeah. And with that, I'm actually off to get some milk. Breast milk from my local Starbucks, that is. And on that somewhat perverted bombshell, I'm going to end it all with a cursed meme montage to the song Oh Yeah by the Swiss band, or duet, Yellow. If you didn't like me, kiss my ass.
do.